The story of Egypt doesn't begin with majestic pyramids or the mysterious gods we often associate with its past. It begins much earlier, at a time when the land itself was still being molded by the raw forces of nature. Thousands of years before the first pharaohs donned their crowns, Egypt was a land of wild contrasts, where the fertile waters of the Nile met the barren expanses of the desert. This clash of life and death, abundance and desolation, gave rise to one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. But what was it about this land that gave birth to a civilization that would last for over 3 millennia? As the Ice Age ended, a climatic shift forced early hunter-gatherers from the now arid Sahara towards the Nile. Here, in the narrow strip of land along the riverbanks, they found everything they needed to survive: water, fertile soil, and an abundance of plant and animal life. The river strip that divided the Egyptian territory into 2 parts provided a favorable environment for the rise of civilization when the Nile Valley began in the Miocene times, cutting it into its current shape. The various geographical resources effectively contributed to the state's foundation. As a result of the annual floods that spread the fertile soil to the east and west over the centuries, mud deposits built up. When the water recedes and flows along its banks, the agricultural year begins, making Egypt one of the first agricultural communities that ever existed in human history. At the end of the Paleolithic era, there was a widespread production of arrows, harpoons, querns, sewed skins, one-works, and pottery. Carbon-14 tests, on the other hand, were used by researchers to demonstrate that corn was harvested in a Neolithic silo on the edge of Fayum between 4,600 and 4,250 BC. Later, people built shacks and huts out of reeds and solid mud and sowed corn on the muddy soil of the Nile marshes. Ancient Egypt was divided into 2 territories: Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt lay to the north, where the Nile extended out with its several branches to form the Nile Delta. Upper Egypt, which stretched to Aswan, was to the south. The 2 kingdoms were united around 3000 BC by King Narmer, but each retained its regalia: the Hedjet, or white crown, for Upper Egypt, and the Deshret, or red crown, for Lower Egypt. As a result, the pharaohs were known as the rulers of the 2 lands, and they wore the Shent, a double crown with each half denoting sovereignty of a different land. Upper and Lower Egypt developed distinct cultures and identities, but they were forever linked by the river that sustained them. As the Predynastic period progressed, the villages along the Nile became more interconnected, trade routes flourished, and ideas spread like wildfire. Communities learned from each other, and leaders sought to consolidate power, driven by ambition, religious duty, and the desire to control the ever-crucial Nile. In the centuries that followed, a monumental leap would take place, one that would shape the destiny of Egypt and leave its mark on the world forever. From these modest origins, the foundations were quietly forming for one of humanity's greatest revolutions: the emergence of kingship, the birth of dynasties, and the rise of a timeless empire. The great civilization of Egypt wasn't born overnight, nor was it the product of chance. It emerged through centuries of human creativity, adaptation, and unrelenting ambition. And while the soaring pyramids and legendary pharaohs often capture our imagination, the true origins of Egypt run deeper. It's the story of early humans who, confronted by a harsh and unforgiving land, not only endured, but discovered how to flourish, setting in motion a legacy that would change history forever. As Egypt gradually stepped out of the shadows of prehistory, a new chapter began: the Predynastic period. It was a time of transformation and experimentation, when the roots of a culture were planted, one that would endure for more than 3,000 years. It is in this period, from around 6000 BCE to 3150 BCE, that the seeds of Egypt's later grandeur were planted. Villages became towns, chieftains became kings, and gods began to take form in the minds of people who sought to understand the world around them. The Predynastic period is a time often forgotten in the broader story of Egypt. Yet, without it, the pharaohs and pyramids we so often associate with Egypt would never have existed. This era wasn't marked by large monuments, but by fundamental changes in how people lived, thought, and ruled. The Predynastic period is called by the regions or ancient city sites where these artifacts were discovered, rather than the cultures that lived there. The Halfan culture. The thrived circa 30,000 BCE in the area between Egypt and Nubia, giving birth to the Kadan and Sibyllian cultures, around 10,000 BCE, and the Haraphan culture. All of these cultures are hunter-gatherer societies that gradually grew more sedentary and settled into more permanent settlements based on agriculture. The Fayum Oasis is a natural basin located southeast of the Giza Plateau that gave home to the Fayum, a civilization during 9000 to 6000 BCE. These people lived in the vicinity of a vast lake and made their living through agriculture, hunting, and fishing. The people of Fayum A constructed reed homes with subterranean basements for food storage. Cattle, sheep, and goats were domesticated, and basketry and pottery production flourished. During this period, tribal chieftains assumed positions of power, which may have been passed down to the next generation in a family or tribal unit. Communities went from tiny tribes traveling together to large groupings of diverse tribes living in the same region all the time. The Fayum, a culture, gave rise to the Merimdi during 5000 to 4000 BCE, which was named from artifacts discovered at the location of that name on the western side of the Nile Delta. The majority of Egyptians were farmers, and agriculture was the basis of the Dynastic Egypt economy, and farmers relied on the annual summer floods to grow their crops. We know that the first Egyptian farmers were hunter-gatherers. They planted crops such as wheat, lentils, barley, flax, and peas, in addition to herding animals. According to what was found on a location in the western side of the Nile Delta, the oldest levels of Merimdi Beni Salama that evolved between 8000 to 4300 BC in addition to the Fayum Basin, both dating back to the Neolithic era. The Nile Valley's convex terrain encouraged the development of several basins, which in ancient times were flooded with floodwaters every year that brought silt and mud that fertilized the soil. These basins, of which 130 have been found, served as the irrigation system's reservoirs in ancient Egypt. Granaries were made of clay jars or baskets that were buried up to their necks in the earth. The El Omari culture about 4000 BCE developed on these achievements by building circular homes of higher complexity with plastered mud walls. All of these cultures evolved and flourished in Lower Egypt, northern Egypt, closest to the Mediterranean Sea, whereas Upper Egypt civilization formed later. The inhabitants of the Badarian culture lived in movable tents, like their ancient forefathers, but preferred fixed homes. Following the Badarian period came the Amratian period, also known as Naqada I, which constructed more complex homes with windows and hearths, wattle and daub walls, and windbreaks around the main entryway. The practice of mummification began around 3500 BCE, where burial items were still left with the deceased. These developments were aided by the Gerzian culture, also known as Naqada II, 3500 to 3200 BCE, which launched trading with other regions, inspiring changes in culture and art. The houses were built of sun-baked brick, and the more opulent ones included courtyards, an addition that would become commonplace in Egyptian homes later. The city of Abydos, located north of Nakada, became an important burial location, and huge tombs were built, forming a necropolis, a city of the dead. These tombs were originally made of mud bricks, but subsequently of huge, neatly hewn limestone. Eventually, this site would become the burial place for Egypt's rulers. Despite this, evidence reveals that individuals from all across the nation had their deceased buried at Abydos and gave burial gifts to commemorate their memory. By this time, the cities of Zoi and Hierakopolis were considered ancient, while Thinis, Nakada, and Nekhen were rapidly developing. The hieroglyphic alphabet, which was invented around 3400 to 3200 BCE, was used for maintaining records, although no entire sentences from this period have been discovered. At this time, the earliest Egyptian writing discovered so far originates from Abydos and was discovered on pottery, clay seal imprints, and bone and ivory items. Complete sentences are not found in Egypt until the time of King Peribsen in the Second Dynasty, 500 years later. This period led to the Nakada III, period from 3200 to 3150 BCE. Following Nakada III, the early dynastic period and Egypt's recorded history began. With commerce, communities expanded and flourished, and the populations of both Lower and Upper Egypt increased. Small villages of brick dwellings and buildings evolved into bigger urban centers that soon clashed, most likely for trade products and water resources. Thinis, Nakada, and Nekhen were the three principal city-states of Upper Egypt during the period. Thinis appears to have defeated Nakada before absorbing Nekhen. These early power struggles were likely waged between the enigmatic Scorpion kings, whose true identities remain uncertain, and rival leaders, most notably Ka and Narmer. According to some scholars, Scorpion I, Scorpion II, and Ka were the final rulers of the proto-dynastic period, paving the way for King Narmer, who ultimately unified Upper and Lower Egypt and established the First Dynasty. Around 3150 BCE, a profound transformation unfolded across Egypt. The once fragmented villages along the Nile, divided by local identities and rivalries, were brought together under a single, centralized rule. This marked the beginning of the early dynastic period, a new era in which the first true pharaohs emerged, bearing the symbols of divine kingship, commissioning monumental architecture, and laying the groundwork for the Egyptian civilization as we know it today. In this period, Egypt transitioned from a collection of fragmented chiefdoms to a unified kingdom. And it was in these early centuries that the symbols, structures, and beliefs that defined Egypt for millennia were born. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was one of the most significant events in the ancient world. Menes, the first king of Egypt, was a ruler of Upper Egypt, presumably from Thinis or Hyrcanopolis, who defeated the other city-states around him before conquering Lower Egypt around 3150 BCE. Narmer married the princess Nithotep of Nakada in an arrangement to enhance the links between the two towns. He undertook military operations in Lower Egypt to quell revolts and expand his territory into Canaan and Nubia. He sponsored massive construction projects, and urbanization developed throughout his reign. Hor-Aha, Narmer's son, is assumed to have succeeded him in 3100 BCE, continuing his father's military expansion and increasing trade. He was notably interested in religion and the concept of the afterlife, and it was under his reign that the Mustabe tomb was built. Hor-Aha was replaced by his son Jer in 3050 BCE, who followed in his father's footsteps. His son, Djet, about 3000 BCE, married Princess Mernith and is considered to have taken leadership of the nation after his death. It is uncertain whether she governed as a regent for her infant son Den or as queen, but her reign is notable for being the first time a woman is recorded governing in ancient Egypt. Den, about 2990 BCE, is regarded as the greatest monarch of the first dynasty and reigned for 50 years. His reputation as an efficient monarch stemmed from his economic advances, military conquests, and the stability of his rule, as proven by expensive construction projects and elaborate works of art. Den is the first monarch to be represented wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, showing that he ruled over a unified nation. Den was succeeded by two additional monarchs, Anagib and later Semerket, both of whom had tough reigns marked by insurgency. The dynasty ended with Ka'a's reign, during which his heirs struggled for the throne and were defeated by Hotep-Sekemwi, who established the second dynasty. Internal strife and a lack of, or misunderstanding over, records ruined the second dynasty, 2890 to 2670 BCE. None of the second dynasty monarchs have reliable dates, and several of the king's names appear to be repeats of earlier rulers. Hotep-Sekemwi, which means two powerful ones at peace, is a prime illustration of this issue. Because of his name, it would seem that he came to power after subduing the princes who fought for the throne after Kwa, but his name is inscribed on the entrance to Quea tomb, implying that he was the ruler responsible for burying Quea, and he already had that name before the succession war broke out. Hotep-Sekemwi is credited with bringing peace to Egypt upon his ascension to the throne, although a brief one. Instability and rebellion marked his reign. Raneb, also known as Nipra, was the first to link his name to that of the gods, and so create a bond between the monarch and the divine. There is no reasonable explanation for Peribsen's decision. Early academics claimed he was the first monotheist who declared Set to be the sole deity, but evidence of his reign's devotion to various gods disproved this. Because his name is only found in Upper Egypt, it's possible that he opted to ally with Set for political reasons, to distinguish himself from the Horus religion of Lower Egypt. For whatever reason, he is regarded as a good monarch because commerce, the economy, religious practice, and the arts all thrived during his reign. Peribsen was succeeded by Khesehemwi, likely his son, who continued the building efforts of his predecessors and is credited with restoring, or at least reinforcing, the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. Among his most notable achievements are the statues found at Hierakonpolis and Abydos, as well as his legacy as the father of Pharaoh Djoser. By the close of the early dynastic period, around 2686 BCE, Egypt stood as a unified kingdom with a strong central authority. Its kings had solidified their role as divine rulers, guardians of Ma'at, and creators of monumental tombs that symbolically connected them with the gods. The Third Dynasty marks the beginning of one of the most iconic and celebrated chapters in Egypt's history. It was during this era that Egypt firmly established itself as a dominant power of the ancient world, and it all began with the rulers of the Third Dynasty. Spanning roughly from 2686 to 2613 BCE, this period brought major advancements in architecture, governance, and religious practice. But above all, it is remembered for unveiling a powerful new symbol of Egypt's legacy, the pyramid. This dynasty, though relatively short, was a time of innovation and experimentation. It laid the groundwork for the monumental achievements of the Old Kingdom, and it all began with the reign of one of Egypt's most famous kings, Djoser. The reign of King Djoser, also spelled Zoser, is perhaps the most important of the Third Dynasty, and he is remembered as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. Djoser's rule was marked by a sense of stability and prosperity. Under his leadership, Egypt saw a significant leap in architectural achievements. thanks in large part to his visionary advisor and architect Imhotep. Before Djoser, Egyptian kings were buried in mastabas, flat, rectangular tombs made of mud brick. While these structures were impressive in their own right, Djoser and Imhotep envisioned something far grander. This led to the construction of the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, a structure that would forever change the landscape of Egypt and the course of history. The Step Pyramid, built at Saqqara, was the first monumental stone structure in the world and the first pyramid ever constructed. Djoser's pyramid was built in a series of 6 steps, rising to a height of around 197 feet. The Step Pyramid is a succession of mastabas piled on top of each other, each step slightly smaller than the one beneath, to create a pyramid shape. To deter robbers and secure the king's corpse and burial goods, the real chambers of the tomb were dug beneath the foundation as a maze of passageways with rooms off the hallways. However, this approach ultimately failed. Long ago, the tomb was looted, stripped of its treasures, and even the king's body was taken. Only a single foot was found within its chambers. Yet the Step Pyramid stood for far more than just a royal burial site. It was a bold expression of power and sacred purpose, laying the groundwork for the magnificent pyramids of Giza that would rise in the dynasties to come. The Old Kingdom, spanning roughly from 2686 to 2181 BCE, is often known as Egypt's Age of Pyramids, an era marked by extraordinary architectural ambition, where the power of the pharaohs was immortalized in massive stone monuments. It was during this time that Egypt experienced its first golden age, a period of prosperity, artistic brilliance, and the rise of a highly centralized state. Most famously, this was the age when the Great Pyramids of Giza, eternal wonders of the ancient world, were built. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom were more than kings. They were seen as living gods, divinely appointed to rule over the land. Their ability to organize vast labor forces and construct monumental structures was a reflection of their divine power. But the Old Kingdom was not just about monumental building. It was also a time when the political, social, and religious foundations of Egyptian civilization were cemented, leaving a lasting legacy that endured for millennia. The historical documents of this time, the 4th to 6th dynasties of Egypt, are sparse, and historians consider the history of the era as literally written in stone, and mainly architectural in that academics have been able to build a history through the statues and their inscriptions. The pyramids themselves provide little information about their architects, but adjacent funerary shrines and stelae provide the king's names and other significant information. In addition, carvings in stone discovered elsewhere during the period document different events and the dates on which they happened. Lastly, the mausoleum of the 5th dynasty's last monarch, Unas, contains the first pyramid texts, detailed drawings and writings inside the tomb, that cast light on the religious views of the period. During the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the elite standardized art, and figures were produced uniformly to reflect the tastes of Memphis, the capital. Although other art forms such as painting and literature exhibit more skill in the Old Kingdom, statues from the late early Dynastic and early Old Kingdom periods are very comparable. The Old Kingdom's most famous works of art are the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx of Giza, both of which remain today, although smaller structures were crafted with the same precision and beauty. To coordinate the labor force that constructed the pyramids at Giza and elsewhere during this time, unprecedented bureaucratic efficiency was needed, and this bureaucracy could only function under a powerful central authority. At the top of the pyramid that it represented Egyptian society, the monarch stood. He was granted ownership of all of Egypt by the gods, at least in theory. The literate and illiterate classes were divided in the Egyptian social structure. The literate class was the ruling class. They were a small fraction of the population, but they were the main criteria for determining the character of ancient Egyptian society and everything we know about the civilization. Individuals were frequently more important than the positions they held. As a result, while the king established the scope of bureaucratic power, effective administration was ultimately dependent on the same pool of literal aristocrats without whom the king could not govern, and we'll state some of them as follows. Because an Egyptian king could not personally control every area of society, the role of the vizier was established as early as the early dynastic period. The vizier, who can be assimilated into a form of prime minister, assigned a response possibility to other members of the court, sent communications through scribes, and managed the military regional governors' activities, public works projects, and tax collections, among other things. Huni, the last king of the Third Dynasty, was long thought to have initiated the massive building projects of the Old Kingdom by constructing the Meidum Pyramid. But credit for the Meidum Pyramid goes to Sneferu, the first king of the Fourth Dynasty, who may have been Huni's son by one of his minor queens. Sneferu began the Old Kingdom's golden era, with his most noteworthy achievements being the two pyramids constructed for him at Dashur. Sneferu started his work with the pyramid at Meidum, now as the false pyramid due to its shape. It resembles a tower more than a pyramid, and its exterior casing is surrounded by a massive mound of gravel. The Pyramid of Meidum was Egypt's first real pyramid, but it did not last. This is because changes were made to Imhotep's initial pyramid design, causing the exterior casing to sit on sand rather than rock, causing it to fall. The Crooked Pyramid and the Red Pyramid are Sneferu's structures at Dashur, or North Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid gets its name from the fact that it rises at a 55-degree angle and then changes to a 43-degree angle of smaller stones, giving the impression of bending in towards the summit. The workers had finished the base and sides before recognizing that a 55-degree angle was too steep and changing their plan to conclude the job as best they could. Sneferu appears to have grasped the issue and went on to construct his third pyramid. When the Bent Pyramid failed to satisfy his standards, he simply began over. The Red Pyramid, named after the use of reddish limestone in its building, was constructed on a firm foundation for better stability and arose at a 43-degree inclination. The Red Pyramid, 344 feet tall, was Egypt's first effective real pyramid. It was originally encased in white limestone, as were the other later pyramids, which crumbled away over time and were collected by locals for other construction projects. Following in the footsteps of Djoser's complex at Saqqara, Sneferu had mortuary temples and the other structures built around his pyramids, with priests overseeing day-to-day activities once the Red Pyramid was finished. All of this points to the stability of his rule, which he bequeathed to his son, Khufu, when he died. The ancient Greek authors referred to Khufu as Cheops, and he's best known for his Great Pyramid at Giza. In their works, the Greeks portrayed him as a tyrant who oppressed the people and compelled them to labor for him against their will. This perception may have been created by the tales contained in the Westcar Papyrus, a compilation of 4 stories written about the kings of the Fourth Dynasty, and found by Henry Westcar in around 1824 CE. The papyrus contains 4 tales recounted by Khufu's sons, including one in which King Khufu summons a sorcerer who claims to be able to reconnect a decapitated head to a body, and some academics read his actions in requesting a demonstration as malicious or careless. During the reign of Khufu, Egypt became even wealthier as a result of his military battles against Nubia and Libya, as well as his lucrative trade deals with cities such as Byblos. He also invested in agricultural innovations to improve the livelihoods of his people. During his reign, the world's first documented dam was constructed in Wadi Garawi, a mountain range west of modern Helwan. This dam improved water availability for farms and others in the town. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the final of the ancient 7 wonders of the world and a distinguishing emblem of Egypt. It is situated on the Giza Plateau near the modern city of Cairo and was constructed over 20 years during the rule of Khufu. Although many hypotheses exist regarding the pyramid's purpose, the most generally acknowledged idea is that it was built as a tomb for the king. However, how it was constructed remains a mystery to this day. Historians continued to dispute the idea of ramps going around the outside of the building to move the blocks into position. These theories persist despite a growing body of evidence proving that the pyramid was constructed by the ancient Egyptians using technical means that were most likely so common to them that they felt no need to document them. Nonetheless, the complexity of the interior passages, shafts, and chambers, as well as the nearby Osiris shaft, encourages the persistence of these fringe theories, as does the mystery of how the pyramid was built at all and its orientation to cardinal points. A prominent figure during that time called Hemiunu was the vizier during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty, and one of the king's relatives. He was in charge of building his Great Pyramid and keeping an eye over its construction works, and he was buried near Khufu's pyramid. The construction work of the pyramid was done by expert and unskilled laborers employed by the state for the job. These employees either offered to pay off a debt, performed community service, or were paid for their time. The annual inundation of the Nile River was important for Egyptian survival because it distributed rich soil from the riverbank all across the shore's farmlands. However, it also made farming those lands impossible during the flood. During these times, the government supplied work for farms by constructing large monuments. These were the individuals who performed the real physical labor of moving stones, elevating obelisks, constructing temples, and constructing the pyramids that continue to amaze and motivate people today. Khufu was replaced by a family member outside the legal line called Djedefre after his death. Djedefre was Khufu's son, but he did not appear to be his designated heir. Some scholars believe Djedefre built the Great Sphinx of Giza, while others believe Khafre, his sibling and successor, built it. The Sphinx is the world's biggest monolithic monument, showing a recumbent lion's torso with a king's head and visage. Historically, this king's visage has been identified as Khafre's, but Dobrev and others believe it's Khufu's. It appears to have been constructed by Khafre because it is exactly in line with this pyramid complex, and the Sphinx's face resembles Khafre more than Khufu. Khafre's pyramid is the second largest in Giza, and his complex is almost as big as his father's. Little is known about his rule. According to Egyptian texts, he continued his father's policies and government model by concentrating power in the hands of his closest family members and exerting strict control over policies and laws. Following Khafre's demise, succession was temporarily disrupted again when Baka Djedefre's son took the throne. He did not even rule for a year before Menkaure, Khafre's son, took over his monarch. Both the Greeks and the Egyptian writings praise Menkaure. Menkaure, like his father and grandpa before him, started construction on his Giza pyramid and shrine complex. Menkaure's pyramid and complex are smaller than the other two, which represent a significant development in the history of the Old Kingdom and one of the causes of its collapse. The resources required to construct the Great Pyramid were no longer accessible during Menkaure's period, but he did his best to establish an everlasting residence on par with his fathers and grandfathers. Quenre, Menkaure's son and designated successor, perished while this pyramid was being constructed, upsetting the dynastic succession, and Menkaure died before the pyramid complex was finished. Despite reigning for 30 years, he was unable to finish the work of his predecessors, which many historians attribute to the dwindling resources at his disposal. Shepseskaf, Menkaure's successor, finished Menkaure's structure at Giza, but was buried in a relatively modest mastaba at Saqqara. As previously stated, the monarchs diverted immense resources to their funerary structures and buildings. But these temples and sanctuaries were increasingly under the authority of the priests who managed them rather than the king. Although the Giza Plateau is now an old, sand-swept location on the outskirts of Cairo, it was a city of the deceased inhabited by the living who tended to it during Menkaur's time. Giza had priests' houses, shrines, worker accommodations, stores, factories, breweries, and all the amenities of a small metropolis. The civilian life in ancient Egypt was very active. The lowest social class consisted of peasant farmers who did not own the land on which they worked or the houses in which they resided. The monarch, members of the court nomarchs, and priests owned the land. To begin the day, peasants would say, "Let us work for the nobility." Peasants were virtually always farmers, regardless of what other trade they practiced. They cultivated and harvested their crops, giving the majority to the landowner while keeping part for themselves. Most had private gardens, which the ladies maintained while the men worked in the fields. The lowest stratum of society created the items utilized in commerce, allowing the civilization as a whole to survive. These peasants were also part of the workforce that erected Egypt's pyramids and other monuments. When the Nile River's banks overflowed, farming became difficult, and the men and women went to work on the king's projects. This labor was always rewarded, and no literary or physical evidence supports the assertion that any of Egypt's major monuments were erected by slave labor. Work-building monuments like the pyramid and associated burial complexes, temples, and obelisks provided the peasantry with the sole possibility of upward mobility. Skilled painters and engravers, in particular, were in high demand in Egypt and were paid more than unskilled laborers who merely hauled the stones for the construction from one location to another. Peasant farmers might also raise their status by learning a craft and producing the vases, bowls, plates, and other ceramics that people need. Skilled carpenters could make a fortune by making tables, desks, chairs, beds, and storage chests, while painters were needed to decorate upper-class dwellings, castles, tombs, and monuments. Brewers were likewise held in high regard, and breweries were occasionally controlled by women. They appeared to have been operated on by females in early Egyptian history. Beer was the most popular beverage in ancient Egypt, and it was commonly utilized as a kind of recompense. 3 times a day, workers on the Giza Plateau were given a beer ration. The deity Osiris was said to have provided the drink to the people, and breweries were overseen by the goddess Tenene. Marriages were more secular than religious in ancient Egypt. The parents planned the majority of weddings in any of the classes. Girls were often married at the age of 12 and boys at the age of 15. Royal offspring were frequently promised to foreign monarchs as babies to seal treaties. The ancient Egyptians' lives were not all labor. They found plenty of time to have fun by participating in sports, board games, and other activities. Hockey, handball, archery, swimming, tug-of-war, gymnastics, rowing, and a sport known as water jousting, which was a sea battle played in small boats on the Nile River in which a jouster tried to knock the other out of his boat while a second team member maneuvered the craft, were all ancient Egyptian sports. The festivals of ancient Egypt were individually distinct in their own right, depending on the nature of the occasion, but they all had one thing in common: drinking and feasting. The Egyptian diet consisted mostly of grains, wheat, and vegetables. The meat was incredibly expensive, and only royalty could afford it. The 4th dynasty ended with Shepseskaf's brief reign, and the 5th started with much less hope. The 5th dynasty is known as the Sun King's dynasty because so many of their titles contain the name of the deity Ra, usually given as Re. The first 3 of these rulers, Userkaf, Sahure, and Kakai, would later be memorialized as divinely chosen in the Westkar papyrus tale The Birth of the Kings. The dynasty starts with King Userkaf, but a lady called Kenkawis, most likely a daughter Menkaure, appears prominently in the Egyptian texts as mother of two kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, though it's unclear who those monarchs were. Her monument is the fourth pyramid at Giza, and she was a significant person. Not much is known about her. Userkaf is best renowned for his work on the Temple of the Sun in Abu Sir. This structure represents a significant divergence from the position of the monarch at the beginning of the Fourth Dynasty and the beginning of the end of Giza as the king's necropolis. The sun deity Ra was now venerated directly by the people through the priesthood, and the king's position as the god's primary representative was reduced. Userkaf's son Sahure replaced him and constructed his funerary complex at Abu Sir near the Temple of the Sun. Sahur was a capable monarch who led the first Egyptian expedition to Punt and arranged significant trade treaties with other countries. Punt, on the other hand, was one of his biggest accomplishments, as it became an important source of many of Egypt's most valuable resources and, in time, was regarded as a legendary country of the gods. Sahur constructed his own temple to the sun in Abu Sir and was the first to use palmiform columns in the building, which would later become the norm for columns throughout Egypt. Sahur's war exploits and cautious resource management enriching the nation, as demonstrated by the intricate work done on his mortuary complex and the inscriptions discovered. His son, Neferirkar Kakai, succeeded him. Inscriptions suggest he was a good king and well-regarded, but little is known of his tenure except that the priesthood got even more dominant during his control. His son, Neferefre, succeeded him but perished young, possibly around the age of 20. He was followed by King Shepsekar. Nusere-Ini succeeds him, and the priests of Ra acquire even more authority during his rule. The bureaucracy of the temples and mortuary buildings grew as well, putting a burden on the royal coffers, which paid for sanctuary care and maintenance. Menkaure Kayu replaced him, but little is known about his rule other than the fact that he was the last monarch to construct a temple to the sun. Djedkar Isesi replaced him in the late 25th to mid-24th century BC. The roots of Djedkar Isesi are unclear. He's not regarded Menkaure Kayu's son, but he may be connected. To keep the economy stable, he reforms the administration and the clergy extensively during his rule. Djedkar Isesi refused the customary practice of erecting a shrine to the sun deity and decreased the number of clerics required to maintain funerary structures. He also arranged this second Punt expedition, which enriched Egypt and reinforced relations with Punt. The most important element of Djedkar Isesi's reign, however, was the decentralization of the government in Memphis, which gave local authority more authority. Djedkar Isesi was replaced by his son Unas, the reign of whom is a little documented. Unas was the first Egyptian king to have the interior of his tomb decorated and inscribed with what became known as the pyramid texts. These inscriptions depict the king in communion with Ra and Osiris. The position of the king was already considerably reduced when the Sixth Dynasty started. Local officials and bureaucrats built more elaborate tombs than nobles during the rule of the first monarch, Teti. Teti was killed by his bodyguards, according to the 3rd century BCE historian Manetho, an act that would have been inconceivable earlier. He was replaced by Userkare, who may have been involved in the assassination plan. His reign was brief, and he was followed by Merir Pepi I, during whom the nomarchs gained authority. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the political power had fragmented, and the system was decentralized. The restoration of central power was a lengthy process that lasted well into the 12th dynasty. Because of the breakdown of central power, political authority passed into the hands of the nomarchs, who took complete control. This pattern persisted during the reigns of Merenra Nemtiemsaf I and Neferkare Pepi II, who ascended to the kingdom as a child and perished as an old man, signifying an incredible rule of nearly a century. During Pepi II's lengthy rule, the Old Kingdom gradually crumbled. The increasing influence of provincial nomarchs and the clergy eroded the central government's and king's authority. Pepi II was followed by Marinri Nemtiemsef II with a very short reign, and the dynasty ended with Necherker, who was identified by some scholars and Egyptologists as the Queen Nitocris from Herodotus' account of an Egyptian queen who avenges her brother's murder by drowning his killers at a banquet. Pepi II, having outlived any potential heirs, proved to be an increasingly ineffective ruler in his later years. When drought and famine struck the land, there was no strong central authority left to respond. The Old Kingdom came to an end with the close of the 6th dynasty, as no powerful successor rose to unify and lead the nation. Local governors became focused on their own regions, lacking both the resources and the will to support the broader kingdom. As Egypt slipped into the turmoil of the First Intermediate Period, the memory of the Old Kingdom's grandeur and order endured, serving as a beacon for future pharaohs. The accomplishments of this golden age had laid the bedrock for the enduring greatness of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. The First Intermediate Period, spanning roughly from 2181 to 2055 BCE, is often described as a dark age in Egypt's history. By the close of the Old Kingdom, the nation was no longer unified. The pharaoh's central authority had crumbled, giving way to a patchwork of semi-independent regions, each governed by its own nomarch. The lack of reliable records about the rulers of the 7th and 8th dynasties reflects just how ineffective and fragmented their reigns were. The ancient city of Memphis was abandoned at some time by rulers who saw themselves as the heirs of the Old Kingdom kings. The rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties then seized Heracleopolis as their center and declared themselves Egypt's real kings. Intef, a Theban nomarch who bore the customary epithets of Great Overlord of the Nome and Overseer of Priests, came to prominence in Thebes around 2125 BC and opposed the authority of Heracleopolitan kings. Intef the first established Egypt's 11th dynasty and provided the push for the country's unity. During the Middle Kingdom, he was known as Intef the Mighty, and a monument in his honor was erected in the Temple of Karnak, and this was the way leading to the beginning of a new era, which was the Middle Kingdom. As Egypt entered the Middle Kingdom, the memory of the First Intermediate Period served as a reminder of the fragility of unity and the importance of strong, centralized leadership. The lessons learned during this period would shape the course of Egyptian history for centuries to come. Although Mentuhotep II was known as the Second Menes, who united Egypt and ushered in the Middle Kingdom period, the road that unity was laid out by Intef I and his successors. Mentuhotep I, approximately 2115 BCE, followed Intef I's path and conquered the neighboring nomes for Thebes, considerably increasing the city's stature and strength. His initiatives were carried on by his predecessors. Mentuhotep II used these early victories to ultimately beat Heracleopolis and then punish those nomes who had stayed faithful to the old kings while rewarding those who had honored Thebes. Mentuhotep II devoted his time after the process of unity to the ruling, military accomplishments, and construction projects. Mentuhotep II's successor, Mentuhotep III, reigned during 2010 to 1998 BCE, maintained and expanded his programs. He dispatched an army to Punt and strengthened the northern delta's borders. Mentuhotep IV replaced him. His entire 7-year rule is silent, but he most likely continued his predecessor's policies effectively because the nation is thriving when Amenemhat replaces him as monarch. When Amenemhat was Mentuhotep IV's vizier and was sent with his mission to quarry stones for the king's project, He had an inscription made of the extraordinary events he witnessed. First, a gazelle gave birth on the stone selected for the king's sarcophagus top, indicating that the stone had been chosen correctly because it was endowed with fecundity and life. Second, an unanticipated rainfall descended on the celebration, revealing a well big enough to water the entire gathering. This inscription was later interpreted to mean that Amenemhat was chosen by the gods to become king, as the gods had allowed him to experience miracles. Amenemhat I abandoned Thebes for unknown reasons and established his seat in court in Ititawi, south of Memphis. Amenemhat I's successor, Senusret I, 1971 to 1926 BCE, improved the country's infrastructure and initiated the kinds of grand building projects that had characterized the Old Kingdom and represented the king's power, including a temple to Amun at Karnak, which sparked the construction of the Great Temple complex there. Amenemhat I had followed in the footsteps of Wahunk-Intef II and Mentuhotep II by restricting the authority of local nomarchs and priests and giving power only to those most trusted in the family. Senusret I continued the same strategy. The administration of the 12th dynasty was so effective that, unlike the Old Kingdom, it kept wealth centralized with the monarch while allowing for the development and prosperity of individual regions without allowing them to become too strong. The king governed all of Egypt, but specific officers were rewarded for their devotion. The Egyptians developed various advanced ways of irrigation systems, and to keep track of the water levels, they built nilometers to gauge the height of the flood and to determine the taxes levels supposed to be paid. Canals were dug to provide water to different areas. When Senusret II decided to turn the Fayum area into an agricultural center, he developed a specific irrigation system with a dike that transported water from Lake Moeris, which resulted in crop prosperity in the area. He was also behind the construction of the White Chapel, a building important to historians and academics because it contains a record of all the nomes of the period. Senusret I was followed by Amenemhat II, 1929 to 1895 BCE, who may have governed alongside him. The practice of co-regency was unique to the Middle Kingdom, in which a younger man, the monarch's selected heir, usually a son, would govern alongside the king to learn the position and guarantee a seamless transfer of power. Scholars disagree on whether this practice was truly followed, though there is no question that it was followed by Amenemhat II and his successor Senusret II, 1897 to 1878 BCE. Double dates for two rulers on official cartouches indicate co-regency. Amenemhat II's reign is little known, but Senusret II is noted for his excellent ties with the regional nomarchs and improved prosperity of the nation. It's worth noting that during Senusret II's rule, local officials thrived just as they had at the end of the Old Kingdom, but this did not cause the kingdom the difficulties that it had previously. Senusret II was followed by Senusret III, 1878 to 1860 BCE, the most potent monarch of the period, whose reign was so prosperous that he was deified during his lifetime. His rule is characterized by military advancement into Nubia, as well as a rise in Egypt's riches and influence. Senusret III exemplified the Egyptian cultural value of military ability, and quick action was the pinnacle of the warrior king. He was thought to be unbeatable at the helm of his troops. His expeditions into Nubia widened Egypt's borders, and the fortifications he erected along the boundary facilitated commerce. He also conducted an expedition into Palestine, and as a result, trade ties with that area improved. And to control floods and direct irrigation waters, the ancient Egyptians built earth and stone barrages and dams, such as El Lahun Dam, which was erected during the reign of King Amenemhat III, who ruled in the 12th dynasty following the reign of Senusret III, as he wanted to make good use of the floodwaters for the irrigation system and to protect the state from destructive high levels of inundation waters. Early November, before the water had entirely left the basins, was the time when preparations for the planting season began. before fields were prepared for planting, irrigation facilities were repaired or cleared, and property lines were reevaluated. And since ancient Egyptians were known to document every detail of their daily life, we have seen the process of growing and harvesting the grain depicted in great detail in various tombs paintings. Various crops were planted widely, which made food types plentiful in Egypt, such as emmer wheat, which was used to make bread and beer, grapes for wine, palm dates, doom palms, figs, sycamore, and papyrus, whose stems were used to make paper-like scrolls for writing, and also was a great material to make sails, cords, and even mats. Various tools were used by the farmers during the planting process, such as a very interesting one called shadoof. It's a hand-operated device used to lift water from the river, which consists of a long pole with a bucket hung on a rope from one end, and the other end has a weight attached to it. It was either used to fill jugs with water to transport them, or even to run water in small canals along ditches. However, it's normal when people wonder how such a civilization in ancient times managed to erect huge buildings and move colossal statues without having the technology we have in the current modern world. Some scenes from tombs of high officials have proof of how the whole process of moving huge statues was done. Jehudi Nacht was a nomarch of the 12th dynasty. He used to govern the 15th nome of Upper Egypt. He has a very interesting scene in his tomb of the transportation of a roughly 22.3 feet high monument of him by 172 people using ropes in a slide, in an endeavor aided by the dumping of water in front of the slide. Unfortunately, no evidence of this colossus has ever been discovered. Amenemhat III boasted of no major military triumphs, but constructed almost as many monuments as his father, and was responsible for the vast mortuary sanctuary at Hawara known as the Labyrinth. Amenemhat IV, 1815 to 1807 BCE, replaced him and maintained his policies. He completed his father's construction tasks and began many of his own. During his reign, military and commercial expeditions were undertaken on numerous occasions, and trade thrived with towns in the Levant, particularly Byblos and elsewhere. The co-regency policy, if it was implemented, had guaranteed a seamless transfer of power from ruler to ruler, but it failed in the case of Amenemhat IV, who had no male successor to prepare for success. After his demise, the throne passed to his sister, or probably wife, Sobekneferu, 1807 to 1802 BCE, whose rule is little known. Unless the queen Nidigret, Nitocris, of the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom is accepted as real, Sobekneferu was the first woman to govern Egypt since the early dynastic period. The 12th dynasty concluded when she perished without an heir, and the 13th started with the reign of Sobekotep I, 1802 to 1800 BCE. The Middle Kingdom's 12th period was the most powerful and wealthy. The 13th dynasty would receive the riches and the policies but would be unable to put them to good use. The 13th dynasty appears to have maintained the policies of the 12th dynasty monarchs and kept the nation united. But none of them had the personal power of the previous kings, according to incomplete documents. Lower Egypt started to develop its political groups. The Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt is a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, the strength of effective leadership, and the enduring brilliance of a flourishing civilization. Though often overshadowed by other periods, it provides a captivating window into the evolution of one of history's greatest empires. The second intermediate period was marked by fragmentation, foreign rule, and deep political instability in ancient Egypt. It began when the kings of the 13th dynasty moved the capital from Ich-Tawi to Thebes, once the seat of the late 11th dynasty in Upper Egypt. This shift in power weakened their control over the northern regions and set the stage for further division. Amenemhat I, 1991 to 1962 BCE, established the tiny settlement of Hutwaret in the far north at the start of the 12th dynasty, which developed into a commercial hub with easy access to the sea and the road paths to Sinai and the area of Palestine. During the 13th dynasty, effective trade and immigration brought an increase of Semitic people to Avaris, who ultimately grew wealthy and powerful enough to wield governmental power in the nation. These individuals were known to the Egyptians as Heko Kasut or Hyksos. The Hyksos, whose origins are still debated, were likely a Semitic people from the Levant, possibly from areas that are now modern-day Syria or Palestine. Their rise to power marks one of the few times in ancient Egyptian history when the country was ruled by foreign kings. The term Hyksos comes from the Egyptian phrase Heko Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. They first arrived in Egypt as migrants and traders, taking advantage of Egypt's wealth and fertile land. Over time, they became more influential, establishing their capital at Avaris in the northeastern Nile Delta, and eventually seizing political control of Lower Egypt. The monarchs documented for the latter portion of the 13th and 16th dynasties are non-Egyptians, or, at the very least, do not have Egyptian names and are considered Hyksos rulers. Their timeline is muddled, and some names are only known from ceremonial items, while others are only known from pieces of kings' lists, making dating problematic. The Hyksos achieved economic dominance of the eastern delta, and then pushed north, negotiating treaties and forging contracts with various nomarchs, governors, of other districts in Lower Egypt, until they had conquered a sizable amount of territory and could exert political authority. Once established in Avaris, the Hyksos elevated Egyptians to positions of power, adopted Egyptian customs and attire, and absorbed Egyptian deity worship into their own beliefs and ceremonies. The Hyksos monarchs established Egypt's 15th dynasty, but once they were evicted, the invading Thebans destroyed all traces of the Hyksos in Egypt. Only a few Hyksos rulers are known by name, thanks to the ruins of inscriptions and other texts discovered at Avaris and elsewhere, including the best-known, Apepi. Apepi was also known as Apophis, and had an Egyptian name related to the giant snake Apophis, or Apep, the sun god Ra's nemesis. At the same time, the Hyksos rose to prominence in northern Egypt. The Nubians rose to power in the south. The Middle Kingdom's 13th dynasty, like Lower Egypt's, had forgotten to pay attention to its southern frontier. Thebes remained Upper Egypt's capital, but instead of dominating the entire nation, it was wedged between the Hyksos in the north and the Nubians in the south. According to Manetho, Apepi of the Hyksos wrote to the Theban king Seqenenretau, 1580 BCE, "Do away with a hippopotamus pool to the east of the city, for it prevents me from sleeping day and night." The message was most likely about the Theban practice of hippopotamus hunting, which would have been insulting to the Hyksos, who worshipped Set and included the hippo in their religious observances. Seqenenretau, rather than complying with the request, saw it as a challenge to his autonomy and marched on Avaris. His mummy shows severe wounds he received in battle. Seqenenre's death in combat against the Hyksos marked the beginning of an all-out war between the two factions. Seqenenre's successors, his sons Kamose and Amose I, continued the fight against the Hyksos. Kamose launched a series of military campaigns against the Hyksos, gradually weakening their grip on Egypt. His bold attacks on Avaris and other Hyksos-controlled territories laid the groundwork for the eventual expulsion of the foreign rulers. The final blow to the Hyksos came under the leadership of Ahmose I, the younger brother of Kamose. Around 1550 BCE, Ahmose led a decisive campaign against the Hyksos, capturing their capital, Avaris, and driving them out of Egypt altogether. What became of the Hyksos after their defeat remains uncertain. Ahmose's victory brought about the reunification of Egypt and marked the end of the Second Intermediate Period. With the Hyksos driven out, Ahmose established the 18th dynasty, ushering in the new kingdom, an era of renewed power, imperial ambition, and cultural brilliance. Under this new dynasty, Egypt would once again rise to greatness, constructing some of its most iconic monuments since the time of the Old Kingdom's pyramids and expanding its borders into a true empire. Ahmose's victory over the Hyksos was more than just a military success. It was a powerful political and symbolic moment that reunited Egypt and ushered in a new era. Once Egypt's borders were secured, Ahmose focused on restoring and fortifying the kingdom from within. His campaigns against the Hyksos brought him and his army into contact with regions in Palestine and Syria, where he continued his military operations. At the same time, he launched expeditions southward against the kingdom of Kush and Nubia, extending Egypt's influence beyond its traditional frontiers. When he died, he had protected the nation and consolidated his authority, leaving a steady political and economic situation for his replacement, Amenhotep I, 1541 to 1520 BCE. Inscriptions show that Amenhotep I followed his father's policies and modeled himself after him as a warrior monarch, but he most likely only commanded battles in the Nubia. Thutmose I, 1520 to 1492 BCE, replaced him and immediately started wars to expand Egypt's reach. Thutmose I put down a revolt in Nubia that erupted soon after assuming the throne, personally murdering the Nubian monarch and suspending his corpse from the prow of his ship as a caution to other rebels. He then extended Egypt's control over Nubia further south before shifting his focus to Palestine and Syria. He expanded Thebes's famous Temple of Karnak and built numerous other temples and structures throughout Egypt. Thutmose II, 1492 to 1479 BCE, succeeded him, but little is known about his rule because he was quickly eclipsed by his more potent half-sister Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut, 1479 to 1458 BCE, was one of the most potent and effective New Kingdom rulers. Thutmose II had one child with her, and he had another with a minor woman, Thutmose III, whom he named as his successor, 1458 to 1425 BCE. Following Thutmose II's death, Hatshepsut was appointed regent of Egypt and officially co-ruled with Thutmose III, but she had been the force behind her husband's tenure and continued to do so as she saw fit after his death. Hatshepsut is in charge of numerous construction initiatives. She conducted the most successful expedition to Punt, added her works to the temple at Karnak, and governed in harmony with Nubia to the south. Her construction undertakings were so beautiful and numerous that subsequent pharaohs claimed ownership of them. They were able to do so because Hatshepsut's name was taken from all of her structures, including her magnificent complex at Deir el-Bahri, around 1458 BCE. Concerning the obelisks that were erected in the different temples, they were symbols of the sun god, and many of them can be found everywhere in the whole world, whether they were real Egyptian ones or modern ones imitating the ancient Egyptian obelisks. The process of carving one is, and not, a paradox, as there is an unfinished one located in the quarries of granite and Aswan. Hatshepsut commissioned its construction, probably to accompany what became known as the Lateran Obelisk, which was originally at Karnak, and was later brought to the Lateran Palace in Rome. Thutmose III inherited a wealthy and secure country in 1458 BCE and wasted no time in improving it. Thutmose III establishes the Egyptian Empire, which his descendants would sustain. He defeated the neighboring countries and expanded Egypt's dominion further than it had ever been before, using the war chariot acquired from the Hyksos, bronze weaponry, and better strategies. Over 20 years, he led at least 17 separate military campaigns, subduing kingdoms from Libya to Syria and extending Egypt's authority in the south from the region around Buhen down to Kurgus. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III ascended to power. Believing him to be weak and inexperienced, The king of the Syrian city of Kadesh instigated a revolt in the Egyptian province of Canaan, which swiftly gathered support from other places aiming to dethrone Egypt. This coalition met in the city of Megiddo. Thutmose III marched his army from Thebes to Megiddo in northern Canaan, prudently choosing a narrow pass from the town of Aruna instead of the wider and easier routes to the city, and surprised his enemies by entering the China Valley behind their defensive positions and driving them from the field. Thutmose III had to lay siege to the city to seize it. Following the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose III would subdue and punish those who took part, capturing not just Kadesh, but also all of Syria and the Mitanni territories and Mesopotamia. He was succeeded by his son Amenhotep II, 1425 to 1400 BCE, who inherited and built on his father's powerful and safe kingdom. He was not a warrior king, but he did order many construction projects and signed peace treaties and commerce deals with other countries such as Mitanni. Thutmose IV, 1400 to 1390 BCE, his replacement, carried on his programs. Based on readings of his renowned Dream Stele, which recounts the tale of how he came to the kingdom, Thutmose IV is regarded as a usurper, although he is the legal son of Amenhotep II. He's best known as the king who rebuilt Giza's Great Pyramid. The reign of Amenhotep III, 1386 to 1349 BCE, is often seen as the height of Egypt's wealth and artistic achievement. Under Amenhotep III, Egypt enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and stability. His reign was marked by a flourishing of the arts, architecture, and diplomacy. He kept the nation stable, enlarged its boundaries, and devoted himself to the arts and construction initiatives. Many of Egypt's most impressive structures date from his rule. During his reign, however, the priests of Amun started to acquire increasing fortune. They possessed more property than the monarch, and used it to enrich themselves further. Amenhotep III attempted to contain their increasing influence by allying himself with Aten, a minor deity symbolized by a sun disk. He appears to have believed that the authority of the pharaoh behind the worship of Aten would elevate the status of those priests over those of Amun. His scheme failed, but it did elevate the deity Aten, who would play an important role in the rule of Amenhotep's son and successor. Amenhotep IV, 1353 to 1336 BCE, also known as Akhenaten, was an Egyptian pharaoh renowned for establishing monotheism and banishing the ancient gods. His rule became known as the Amarna period because the Egyptian capital was relocated from Thebes to modern-day Amarna. He ascended to the kingdom as Amenhotep IV but changed his name to Akhenaten in the 4th or 5th year of his rule, dissolved the old religion, particularly the worship of Amun, and raised the deity Aten to the position of the one true God. Only the cult of Aten was recognized as a valid religious organization. All other sanctuaries were shuttered and their veneration was prohibited. He built a shrine to Aten at Karnak's great temple of Amun, which he also shuttered. His wife was the famous Nefertiti, best known for the magnificent bust created by the sculptor Thutmose. Upon Akhenaten's death, he was succeeded by his young son Tutankhaten, 1336 to 1327 BCE, who quickly changed his name to Tutankhamun, who took to the throne at just 9 years old. The young leader relocated the capital to Memphis, restored Thebes as a religious center, which also held political significance, reopened the temples, and restored Egypt's ancient religion. Although he instituted significant changes that helped secure the nation, he's best known for his magnificent tomb which Howard Carter found in 1922. Tutankhamun was married to Ankhsenamun, his half-sister, until his demise at the age of about 18. Ankhsenamun may then have married the vizier Ai, possibly 1324 to 1320 BCE, who some experts believe replaced Tutankhamun, or she may have attempted to reign on her own. Whatever part A played in the succession, Ankhsenamun vanished soon after Tutankhamun's death. and the general Horemheb took control, devoting to returning Egypt to its former grandeur. Horemheb, 1320 to 1295 BCE, went to great measures to erase the Amarna period rulers from Egyptian history by burning all of Akhenaten's statues and writings, including completely demolishing his sanctuary at Karnak. Horemheb defended traditional Egyptian religion and customs. Relationships with other countries and Egypt's infrastructure were ignored during Akhenaten's rule. Horemheb returned Egypt to its previous glory, though he was unable to bring it back to the heights of Amenhotep III. He perished without an heir, and his vizier Parames seized the kingdom as Ramesses I, establishing the 19th dynasty. Ramesses I was an elderly man when he ascended to the kingdom, and he swiftly named his son Seti I as a successor. Ramesses I resumed Horemheb's task of rebuilding Egypt's sanctuaries and shrines, as well as adding to the vast temple of Amun at Karnak. He gave Seti I the authority to lead military missions to reclaim areas lost during Akhenaten's rule. When he passed, Seti I ascended to the throne and continued Egypt's reform and revival, adding his own touches to the big project at Karnak and grooming his successor for dominance. His son, Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, is the most well-known pharaoh of Egypt today. Ramses II reigned for an extraordinary 66 years and is remembered as a warrior, builder, and diplomat. His reign is often seen as the last great era of Egyptian power and influence. Ramses II was also a prolific builder, commissioning monumental projects across Egypt. His most famous construction is the magnificent temple complex at Abu Simbel, with its towering statues of the pharaoh and his queen Nefertari carved into the cliffs of southern Egypt. Ramses also expanded the Karnak Temple, built a new capital city called Pi-Ramesses, and constructed massive statues and obelisks that proclaimed his divine power. One of Ramses II's most significant military achievements was his confrontation with the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. Though the battle ended in a stalemate, it resulted in the first known peace treaty in history, solidifying Ramses' reputation as both a warrior and a peacemaker. Anatolia's Hittites had been gaining prominence since the 2nd millennium BC, and by 1530 BC they had surpassed Babylonia as a notable nation, and they were putting Egypt to the test. Letters of intent had been addressed to the 18th dynasty's king Akhenaten, but he had never responded or taken note of Hittite activities along his boundaries. Horemheb had waged unsuccessfully against the Hittites, who had grown even more strong by the time of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's successor, and were daring enough to garrison districts on or near Egypt's borders. When Horemheb became pharaoh in 1320 BCE, he initiated a more forceful campaign against the Hittites and secured Egypt's frontiers, although the problem of Hittite invasions was never fully overcome. Seti I had gained Palestine and Kadesh for Egypt, but, happy with the victory, had made no plans for the city's defense. Now, Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty had to cope with the problem of the Hittite invasion, and gathered his forces at Pi-Ramesses in 1274 BC to remove the Hittites from Kadesh and weaken their army. Riding in his chariot at the head of 4 divisions, 20,000 soldiers, Ramesses II marched his 1st division so quickly that he soon outdistanced the other 3. Near Kadesh, 2 Bedouins were apprehended and asked about the whereabouts of Mu'attali II and his army, to which they replied that the army was nowhere near Kadesh, and that Mu'attali II feared Egypt and the young king. The Bedouins, however, were Hittite spies, and Mu'attali II had already fortified Kadesh, with his chariots, 3,500 of them, and troops, 37,000 men, waiting just over the next hill. According to some combat accounts, Ramesses II caught several more spies who told the awful reality about his condition, but the information arrived too late. Ramesses II had separated himself from the rest of his army in his haste to seize Kadesh and vanquish the Hittite ruler. Just as the Hittite chariots slammed into his camp, he dispatched messages to the other 3 divisions. The Ptah division arrived in time to prevent an Egyptian army defeat, and Ramesses II personally led the remaining Amun division into action many times, pushing the Hittite soldiers back to the Orontes River, where many perished. Muwatalli II just only marched from Kadesh's walls to trap Ramesses II's forces between his army by the river and his advance, but for unexplained reasons he chose to stay in the city and never committed his reserve men to fight. Ramses II declared a great triumph at Kadesh and had a scribe record his narrative of the wonderful fight. Muwatalli II's version differed significantly, most notably in claiming Kadesh is a Hittite victory. While Ramesses II did not capture the city, he did break the Hittite army on the field, and while Muwatalli II kept possession of Kadesh, he did not destroy the Egyptians as he had intended. Merenptah was Ramesses II's 12th son and not his designated successor. He only became pharaoh because all of his siblings had perished during their father's lengthy rule. Merenptah soon adopted his father's image of a warrior monarch, defeating the Libyans in combat and repelling an attack on the Sea Peoples. His description of his exploits includes the well-known Merenptah Stele, which contains the first reference to the Israelites as a tribe. Going forth to the 20th dynasty, Ramesses III was the new kingdom's last powerful king. After Horemheb restored the ancient faith, the priests of Amun's authority grew steadily, drawing income and influence away from the monarchy. Throughout the Ramessid era of the 20th dynasty, the condition deteriorated. The concept of having a war was existing as the threat of the people was remarkably increasing, which forced Ramses III to declare war over them. The nationality of the Sea Peoples is unknown because the only records of their activities are from Egyptian sources that only describe them in the terms of battle, such as the record from the Tani Stele, which reads, in part, "They came from the sea in their warships and none could stand against them." This is characteristic of Egyptian allusions to these enigmatic invaders. Ramesses II, his son and successor Merenptah, and Ramses III are the 3 great pharaohs who chronicle their struggles and triumphs against the Sea Peoples. All claimed huge victories over their opponents, and their inscriptions include the most extensive documentation of the Sea Peoples. During the time of Pharaoh Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples invaded and destroyed the Egyptian commerce hub at Kadesh, and then attempted to invade Egypt again. They began their operations with swift attacks along the coast before pushing toward the delta. In 1180 BC, Ramesses III subdued them, but they returned in force. Ramesses III would have been aware of his predecessors' fights with these people and how violent they were. He decided against a field engagement and instead employed guerrilla tactics as a plan. He set up ambushes around the coast and along the Nile Delta, and his archers were especially efficient, putting them camouflaged along the beach to shower down arrows on the ships at his signal. The ships were set on fire with burning arrows once the crew was dead or drowning. After crushing the naval invasion, Ramesses III turned his focus to what remained of the invading troops on land. He used the same tactics as previously, and in 1178 BC, the Sea Peoples were defeated off the coast of Xoas. Egyptian annals once again depict a spectacular victory in which many Sea Peoples were slaughtered and others were captured and coerced into the Egyptian army and fleet or sold as slaves. Although Ramesses III spared Egypt from invasion, the battle was so costly that the royal treasury was depleted, and the tomb builders at Deir el-Medina could not be paid. This resulted in the first documented labor strike in history, in which workers walked off the job and refused to return until they were properly reimbursed. And then, the momentum of the Egyptian empire started to fade. Ramesses III retained a powerful central authority, secured the borders, and kept Egypt prosperous, but the kingdom was crumbling around him. The office of the Pharaoh of Egypt no longer held the same level of reverence it once did because the priests of Amun served as an intermediary between the gods. Ramesses III was injured in an assassination attempt staged by one of his lesser spouses and perished as a result of his injuries. Ramesses IV, 1155 to 1149 BCE, ascended to the throne only after his elder siblings perished. He attempted to imitate the great pharaohs of the past and did complete several construction projects while battling to keep the empire's declining territory, but he perished after a brief rule. He was succeeded by his son Ramesses V, who fought to retain control against Amun's priests and keep the kingdom together. His successor, Ramesses VI, carried on the fight with little success. Ramesses VII replaced him, followed by Ramesses VIII, about whom little is known, Ramesses IX, Ramesses X, and Ramesses XI. All of these pharaohs fought to keep the kingdom together in the face of outside incursions and internal conflicts with Amun's priests. An incident related to these struggles, though obscure, involves a man called Amenhotep, high priest of Amun, who was deposed by the vizier Pinhasi and forced to escape south to Nubia. Although the decline of the new kingdom marked the end of Egypt's age of empire, the legacy of this period would echo through the ages. The awe-inspiring temples of Karnak and Luxor, the royal tombs hidden within the Valley of the Kings, and the dazzling treasures of Tutankhamun continue to mesmerize the world, ensuring that the glory of the new kingdom lives on. Following the death of Ramses XI, Egypt's once unified kingdom fractured into two distinct spheres of influence. Upper Egypt came under the control of the high priests of Amun in Thebes, while Lower Egypt was governed by a succession of kings based in the Nile Delta. One of these rulers, Smendes, 1077 to 1051 BCE, established his authority over Lower Egypt by moving the capital from Per-Ramesses to Tanis, thereby legitimizing his claim to the throne. The Amun priesthood, centered in Thebes, became one of the most powerful forces in Egypt during the Third Intermediate Period. The high priests of Amun, who had accumulated great wealth and power during the New Kingdom, effectively ruled Upper Egypt as independent monarchs. Although they maintained the traditional role of serving the pharaoh, in practice they controlled the land and resources of the south. The most prominent of these rulers was Herihor, a former general who became both the high priest of Amun and the de facto ruler of Thebes. Herihor and his successors wielded considerable authority, commissioning temples, conducting military campaigns, and even using royal titles. The priesthood of Amun became so powerful that they were able to challenge the legitimacy of the kings ruling from the Nile Delta, effectively creating a divided kingdom. Meanwhile, in Lower Egypt, a new group of rulers emerged, the Libyans. Beginning with the 21st dynasty, the Libyans, who had settled in the western delta as mercenaries and migrants, gradually integrated into Egyptian society and rose to power. By the time of the 22nd dynasty, the Libyan rulers had established themselves as the legitimate kings of Lower Egypt. One of the most notable Libyan rulers was Shoshenq I, 943–922 BCE, the founder of the 22nd dynasty. Shoshenq I is perhaps best known for his military campaign into the Levant, where he raided Jerusalem and other cities, an event recorded both in Egyptian inscriptions and in the Bible. Shoshenq I reformed Tanis's administration and Thebes's clergy. The clergy would no longer be a hereditary post, but rather one of nomination by the monarch, as would be the choice of God's wife of Amun. His military operations revitalized Egypt's economy, and the nation started to approach the Egypt of the New Kingdom during his reign. Osorkon II ascended to the throne in 872 BCE and kept the nation together. But after his rule, Egypt split into distinct kingdoms governing from Heracleopolis, Tanis, Sais, Memphis, and Hermopolis in Lower Egypt, and Thebes in Upper Egypt. To the south, the Kashta, 750 BCE, saw Egypt's vulnerability and moved to exploit it. Kashta adored Egyptian culture and had Egyptianized his capital city of Napata, and thus his entire territory. He had strong trade connections with Thebes and was well versed in the procedure of appointing priests and other high officials. Pai, 747-721 BCE, his son, strengthened Nubian dominance of Upper Egypt, and when the kings of Lower Egypt protested, he commanded a large army against them. Pai conquered Lower Egypt, capturing and subjugating all of the main towns before marching back to Napata. Egypt was now legally under his rule, but he allowed the Lower Egyptian kings to regroup and re-establish their power. These buffer zones diminished during the Third Intermediate Period, and Egypt lost its prior strength. But there were still countries on its boundary, such as Judah and Israel, that served the same purpose. The subjugation of those areas by Shoshenq I pushed Egypt's boundary up against the Assyrians, with no buffer in between. Moving forth to the 26th dynasty, Psammetichus I was a powerful ruler who instilled in his people the grandeur of Egypt's past by restoring it through massive projects, renovations, restorations, and military feats. His son, Necho II, 610-595 BCE, continued his father's legacy by conducting military battles, ordering construction projects, and expanding the military. The Egyptians were never great seafarers, and Necho II recognized this by establishing a fleet of Greek mercenaries, which proved quite successful. Necho II is regularly portrayed as a great warrior and military commander who strengthened the nation he had inherited. During the reign of Amasis II, he was successful in reforming government spending while also stimulating the economy and directing war operations. Egypt came together behind his leadership and thrived once more, with a thriving economy, secure boundaries, and prosperous commerce. Building projects, temples, and other works of art were finished, and Egypt's reputation regained some of its lost lusters. He was replaced by his son Psammetichus III, 526 BCE, who was a young and inexperienced king who was ill-prepared for the difficulties he faced. Cambyses II, the Persian king, sent a request to Pharaoh Amasis, asking for one of his daughters in marriage. Unwilling to submit but also hoping to avoid direct conflict, Amasis tried to deceive him by sending the daughter of Apries, his predecessor on the throne, instead. This former Egyptian princess was deeply insulted by the deceit, especially since Egyptian tradition strongly discouraged sending noble women to foreign rulers as brides. Upon arriving at Cambyses II's court, she revealed her true identity. Unlike Cambyses, Darius wanted to govern Egypt in his absence. He ascended to the throne of the Achaemenid Empire in 522 BCE and toured Egypt at least twice, though he favored Egypt from afar. Nonetheless, he adored the culture and directed funds towards the reconstruction of destroyed temples and the dedication of new ones. In keeping with the Persian practice of religious tolerance, Darius praised the Egyptian gods with presents and statues. He is widely viewed as having a gentler hand with Egypt than Cambyses. For the Second Persian conquest of Greece in 480 BCE, his son, Xerxes I, 486-465 BCE, relied on all the resources of the Achaemenid Empire, including Egypt. When the Persians were defeated at Salamis in 480 BCE and Plataea in 479 BCE, Xerxes abandoned foreign affairs in favor of construction projects and different relationships with court ladies. Artaxerxes I, 465–424 BCE, succeeded him, and battled for 6 years to put down the first significant Egyptian rebellion led by Inaros II, the Libyan royal son of Psamtik IV, encouraged and assisted by Athens in 454 BCE. While it is true that the Persians ruled Egypt during the 27th and 31st dynasties, Egyptian culture was kept alive, and the 30th dynasty of Egyptian rulers gave Egypt back a brief time of its former glory before the Persians invaded their land again. This era comprises the 27th to 31st dynasties of Egypt. Egyptian resistance to Persian control, on the other hand, is visible throughout the era, and Egypt thrived under Persian rule because the Persian Shahs respected the culture. Amirtaeus of the 28th dynasty, Nectanebo I, and Nectanebo II all governed the nation, commanded troops, and participated in construction projects in the manner of the great pharaohs of the past. Whoever was behind the revolts against Persian authority, Egypt's second conquest did not last long. Philip II of Macedon, 359–336 BCE, defeated the Greek city-states and incorporated them into Macedonian authority. When he was murdered in 336 BCE, he was preparing a grand expedition to subjugate Persia. He already had all of the means he would require for the conquest, which he entrusted to his son, Alexander. The pharaohs of the 30th dynasty upheld Egyptians' kingship's honor and left their impressive structures in the footsteps of those who came before them. The story of ancient Egypt did not end with Alexander the Great's conquest or the rise of the Ptolemies. Instead, Egypt's rich cultural legacy continued to influence the ancient world, shaping the traditions of the Greeks, the Romans, and many civilizations that followed. Even today, Egypt's cultural achievements continue to inspire awe and fascination, remaining some of the most captivating in the ancient world. Though centuries have passed, modern Egypt in the 21st century still reflects echoes of its ancient past. The Nile remains central to Egyptian life. Spring festivals are still celebrated, and traditional foods carry the flavors of ancient recipes. Many customs have endured, and the final evolution of the ancient Egyptian language, Coptic, is still used in Christian liturgy across Egyptian churches and echoes through the modern Egyptian Arabic dialect. This timeless land continues to be a source of wonder, enchanting the world with its beauty, depth, and mystery. Thank you for your attention and for staying with us until the very end. Your comments, likes, and subscription help us continue sharing history layer by layer.